Princess Lyrelay stood at the tall windows of the Crystal Palace and watched the purple suns set over the city of Luminera. Her blue skin gleamed in the dying light as she pressed her long fingers against the cool glass. Below her, the streets sparkled with floating vehicles and glowing towers that reached toward the stars. Everything was perfect and beautiful, and she hated it. The princess had spent 23 years of her life in this palace. She knew every room, every hallway, every secret passage that the builders thought they had hidden so well. She could walk from her bedroom to the throne room with her eyes closed. She could name every servant, every guard, every advisor who worked in the endless corridors of power. But she had never seen anything else. Her father, King Vorthak, ruled over 47 star systems and countless worlds. His empire stretched across the galaxy and touched the edges of space itself. Ships came and went from Luminara every day, bringing news from distant planets and strange peoples. But Lyrelay was never allowed to leave. She was too precious, too important, too valuable to risk on dangerous travels. The king loved his daughter more than anything in the universe. He had lost his wife when Lyrelay was just a child, and since that day he had protected the princess like she was made of the finest crystal. No harm could come to her while she remained safe in the palace. No enemy could reach her while she stayed behind the energy shields and laser defenses. But safety felt like a prison when all she wanted was to see the stars. Tonight was different, though. Tonight the palace was full of visitors from the Astral Confederacy. Diplomats and nobles had come to discuss trade agreements and defense treaties. The Great Hall buzzed with conversation in a dozen languages, while musicians played soft melodies on instruments that floated in the air. Everyone was distracted by the festivities and political talk. Lyrelay had sat through the dinner and smiled at the right moments. She had listened to boring speeches about shipping routes and mineral rights. She had even danced with Prince Valdris, who had traveled from the outer systems to meet her. The prince was handsome enough, and his family controlled important mining operations, but he looked at her like she was a prize to be won rather than a person to be known. Now the celebration continued in the main halls, while Lyrelay stood alone in her private chambers. She could hear laughter and music through the walls, but it all seemed hollow and false. These people played their games of power while the real universe waited beyond their comfortable worlds. The princess opened her personal communication device and accessed the restricted files her father thought she could not reach. But Lyrelay was clever and had learned to bypass security systems years ago. She studied star charts and navigation data while the computer showed her images of distant worlds. There were planets covered in ice and others that burned with eternal fire. There were worlds where primitive species lived in forests and jungles. Without any technology at all, her father called these places dangerous and worthless. He said the beings who lived there were barely more than animals. They fought with metal weapons and built cities from stone and wood. They had not learned to travel between stars or communicate across space. But something about these simple worlds called to Lyrelay in ways she could not explain. The princess made her decision quickly before fear could change her mind. She put on a dark traveling cloak and gathered a few supplies. Her personal scout ship waited in the private hangar that connected to her chambers. It was a small, fast vessel designed for short trips around the home system. But Lyrelay had modified the engines and navigation systems in secret. The ship could travel much farther than anyone suspected. She slipped through the quiet corridors, while the party continued below. A few servants passed her, but they were used to seeing the princess walk through the palace at night. None of them would think to question where she was going or why she wore a traveling cloak. They certainly would not imagine that she planned to steal a ship and leave the planet. The hangar was empty and dark when Lyrelay arrived. She pressed her hand against the scanner, and the doors slid open with a soft whisper. Her ship sat in the center of the chamber, looking small and fragile compared to the massive warships docked in the main bays. But it was fast, and it was hers, and it would take her to the stars. Lyreley climbed into the pilot seat and began the launch sequence. The engines hummed to life and filled the hangar with blue light. She had practiced this routine hundreds of times in simulations, but never thought she would actually use it for escape. Her hands shook as she entered coordinates for a distant star system that appeared on no official charts. The ship lifted off smoothly and passed through the palace shields without triggering any alarms. Lyreley had programmed the security systems to ignore her vessel during maintenance flights. By the time anyone noticed she was gone, the princess would be far beyond their reach. She flew past the orbital defense platforms and merchant ships that surrounded Luminara. The planet grew smaller behind her until it was just another point of light among the stars. For the first time in her life, Lyreley was truly free. She was alone in the vast darkness with infinite possibilities stretched out before her, but freedom came with dangers she had not considered. As the ship jumped into hyperspace toward the Outer Rim territories, something went wrong with the navigation system. Alarms began to sound, and the controls stopped responding to her commands. The princess fought to regain control as her vessel spun through dimensions of folded space toward an unknown destination. When the ship finally dropped back into normal space, Lyreley found herself surrounded by floating rocks and debris. She had emerged in the middle of an asteroid field with no idea where she was or how to get home. Worse yet, something had damaged the engines during the wild jump. Warning lights flashed across her control panels, and the computer reported multiple system failures. The princess tried to steer between the drifting asteroids, but her ship was falling toward a small blue and green planet that hung in space like a jewel. She had never seen a world quite like it before. Most planets were either too hot or too cold to support life, but this one seemed to glow with warmth and possibility. As her damaged vessel entered the atmosphere, Lyreley saw vast oceans and enormous landmasses covered in green vegetation. There were no cities or spaceports visible from orbit. No energy signatures or communication signals reached her sensors. This was one of those primitive worlds her father had warned her about. A place where dangerous species lived without technology or civilization. The ship crashed through tall trees and carved a deep furrow in the forest floor before finally coming to rest against a rocky hillside. Lyreley was thrown forward against her restraints as metal groaned and systems failed around her. Smoke filled the cabin and sparks flew from damaged circuits. She had to get out before the power core overloaded. The princess forced open the emergency hatch and stumbled into the alien forest. Strange smells filled her nose while unfamiliar sounds echoed through the trees. The air was thick and humid compared to the carefully controlled atmosphere of the palace. Everything here was wild and untamed and beautiful in ways she had never imagined. But Lyreley was hurt and alone and very far from home. Blue blood ran down her arm where metal had cut her during the crash. Her universal translator had been damaged, and she could not communicate with anyone she might meet. Worst of all, she could hear voices calling through the forest as unknown creatures approached her location. Jake Morrison heard the explosion from 3 miles away. He was checking his trap lines in the deep forest when something screamed overhead and crashed into the mountainside with enough force to shake the ground under his feet. Whatever had fallen was big, and it was burning because he could see smoke rising above the tree line. Jake had lived alone in the Canadian wilderness for 5 years now. He had built his cabin by hand and learned to survive without any help from the outside world. Most people thought he was crazy for leaving civilization behind, but Jake preferred the honest dangers of nature to the lies and politics of human society. Out here, a man could think clearly and live by his own rules. But curiosity got the better of him, as it always did. Jake gathered his medical kit and survival gear, then set off through the forest toward the crash site. He moved quietly, between the trees, using skills learned during his time as an army medic. Something told him this was not a normal airplane accident. The first thing Jake noticed was the smell. It was like burned metal mixed with something sweet and chemical. The second thing he noticed was the trail of destruction that ran for almost a quarter mile through the woods. Trees had been snapped off at their roots, and the ground was torn up like a giant plow had ripped through the earth. At the end of the trail, Jake found something that made him question his own sanity. A silver ship sat crumpled against the rocks like nothing he had ever seen before. It was sleek and curved in ways that seemed impossible for human engineering. Strange symbols glowed along its sides, and blue light leaked from cracks in the hull. Jake approached carefully with his rifle ready. He had heard stories about secret government aircraft, but this looked like something from a science fiction movie. The metal was too smooth, and the design was too alien for any earthly origin. As he got closer, he could hear sounds coming from inside the wreckage. Someone was alive in there. Jake found an opening in the hull where metal plates had been bent apart by the impact. He squeezed through the gap and found himself in a small cabin filled with blinking lights and floating displays. Everything was wrong and backwards compared to human technology. The chairs were too tall and the controls were marked with symbols that hurt his eyes to look at. But none of that mattered. When Jake saw the injured woman lying unconscious near what looked like the pilot station, at first glance, she appeared human, except for the blue tint to her skin and the unusual length of her limbs. Her breathing was shallow and blue blood seeped from cuts on her arms and face. Jake did not waste time wondering what she was or where she had come from. His medical training took over as he checked her vital signs and assessed her injuries. She had a concussion and several deep lacerations, but nothing that seemed immediately life-threatening. Her pulse was fast but steady and her airways were clear. The strange woman moaned softly as Jake cleaned and bandaged her wounds using supplies from his kit. Her eyelids fluttered open to reveal eyes that were larger than human eyes and colored, like purple gemstones. She looked at him with confusion and fear before trying to speak in a language that sounded like music mixed with static. Jake held up his hands to show he meant no harm. He spoke slowly and calmly, even though he knew she could not understand him. People responded to tone of voice even when words failed. The woman seemed to relax slightly when she realized he was trying to help rather than hurt her. Something around. Her neck was sparking and smoking. Jake carefully removed what looked like a piece of jewelry but was obviously some kind of electronic device. The woman pointed at it and spoke urgently in her alien language. She seemed to be saying it was important, but Jake could not understand what she needed him to do. Over the next hour, Jake helped the woman out of the crashed ship and into the forest, where they would be safer if the wreckage exploded. She was weak and unsteady on her feet, but she trusted him enough to lean on his shoulder as they walked. They found a clearing near a stream where Jake set up a temporary camp. The woman watched everything Jake did with intense curiosity. She seemed amazed by his simple tools and basic equipment. When he started a fire using flint and steel, she stared at the flames like she had never seen anything so wonderful. When he offered her water from his canteen, she examined the metal container from every angle before drinking. Jake tried to communicate using hand gestures and simple drawings in the dirt. He pointed to himself and said his name over and over, until the woman repeated it back in her musical voice. She pointed to herself and made a sound that was too complex for Jake to pronounce, but he thought it started with something like Lyra. As the hours passed, Jake began to understand that Lyra was not from anywhere on Earth. Her technology was far beyond human capabilities, and her physical differences were too significant to be explained by simple genetic variation. She was an alien, and she had crashed on his planet by accident. But Jake did not care where she came from. She was hurt and alone, and she needed help. That was enough for him. He shared his food and gave her his spare jacket when the night turned cold. He treated her injuries and made sure she was comfortable. Most importantly, he treated her like a person rather than a curiosity. Lyra seemed surprised by Jake's kindness. She watched him carefully, as if trying to understand why a primitive human would help a complete stranger. But as the night wore on, she began to relax around him. She even smiled when Jake told jokes, even though she could not understand the words. The next morning, Jake heard helicopters in the distance. Military aircraft were searching the area and moving closer to their location. Lyra became agitated when she heard the engines overhead. She grabbed Jake's arm and spoke rapidly while pointing at the sky. Her meaning was clear even without words. Those helicopters meant danger. Jake understood that the government would want to capture Lyra and study her technology. They would lock her up in some secret facility and treat her like a laboratory specimen. He had seen how bureaucrats and generals dealt with things they did not understand. They destroyed what they feared and enslaved what they could use. Without hesitation, Jake decided to protect his new friend. He led Lyra deeper into the wilderness where the helicopters could not follow. They moved through dense forest and rocky terrain that would challenge even experienced soldiers. Jake knew these mountains better than anyone, and he used that knowledge to keep them hidden. As they traveled, Jake began working on the damaged device he had taken from around Lyra's neck. It looked like some kind of communication equipment, but it was clearly broken. Jake had always been good with electronics, and he thought he might be able to fix it if he could find the right parts. They were hiding in a cave when Jake heard footsteps outside. He motioned for Lyra to stay quiet as armed soldiers passed by their hiding place. The men were dressed in black tactical gear and carried weapons that looked military, but not standard issue. These were not regular army troops. They were special forces trained for unusual situations. After the soldiers moved on, Jake knew they could not stay in the mountains forever. The search teams would find them eventually, and when they did both, he and Lyra would disappear into some government black site. They needed help from someone Jake could trust. They needed to find his friend Amy, who lived in a research station 20 miles to the north. Dr. Amy Sullivan was a wildlife biologist who studied animal behavior in remote locations. She was also one of the few people who knew about Jake's past and his reasons for living off the grid. If anyone would believe his story about crashed aliens and government cover-ups, it would be Amy. Jake explained his plan to Lyra using gestures and drawings. She seemed to understand that they were going to meet another human who might be able to help. Lyra nodded and gathered the few possessions she had salvaged from her ship. Among them was a small crystal that glowed with inner light and what looked like a tool made from materials that did not exist on Earth. They left the cave at dawn and began the dangerous journey through territory that was now crawling with search teams. Jake used every trick he knew to avoid detection, while Lyra proved surprisingly good at moving quietly through the forest. For someone from an advanced civilization, she adapted quickly to primitive conditions. Along the way, Jake began to see things differently through Lyra's eyes. She was fascinated by everything from insects to weather patterns. She collected samples of plants and rocks like a scientist studying a new world. Her enthusiasm made Jake appreciate the simple beauty of nature that he had taken for granted. When they finally reached Amy's research station, Jake hoped his old friend would be willing to help them. He also hoped the strange woman from the stars would turn out to be the answer to humanity's future rather than its destruction. But as armed vehicles surrounded the building, Jake realized their journey was just beginning. Dr. Amy Sullivan dropped her coffee mug when she opened the door and saw Jake standing there with a blue-skinned woman whose eyes were the wrong shape for any human face. The mug shattered on the floor, but Amy barely noticed because she was staring at the most impossible thing she had ever seen in 20 years of scientific research. Amy had known Jake since college, and she trusted him completely. If he said the sky was green, she would look up to check. But this was beyond anything rational thought could accept. The woman with him was obviously not human, yet she was clearly intelligent and aware. She wore clothes that seemed to be made from materials that shifted color in the light. Jake quickly explained what had happened while Lyra stood quietly beside him. Amy listened to the story of the crashed ship and the government search teams with growing amazement. As a scientist, she wanted to ask 1,000 questions about alien biology and technology. As a friend, she wanted to help Jake however she could. But before Amy could say anything, they heard vehicles approaching through the forest. Heavy engines and radio chatter meant military forces had found the research station. Jake grabbed Amy's arm and pulled her toward the back door, while Lyra followed close behind them. They escaped into the woods just as soldiers surrounded the building. Amy looked back to see men in black uniforms searching her laboratory and equipment. These were not regular army troops, but some kind of special unit trained for unusual situations. She realized Jake had been right about the government cover-up. Amy led them to a hidden bunker she used for emergency supplies during severe weather. The concrete shelter was buried under a hill and could not be seen from the air. Inside were food, water, and communication equipment that Amy used to contact other research stations. While they caught their breath, Amy examined Lyra more closely. The alien woman's biology was similar to human in basic structure, but different in important details. Her bones were longer and more delicate. Her skin had a blue tint that seemed to come from within rather than surface pigmentation. Most importantly, her brain case was larger and shaped differently from human skulls. Lyra seemed equally curious about Amy and Jake. She touched their hair and examined their hands like she was comparing human anatomy to her own species. When Amy showed her a mirror, Lyra stared at her own reflection for several minutes, as if seeing herself clearly for the first time. Jake had been working on the damaged device from Lyra's neck using tools from Amy's workshop. The complex electronics were far beyond human technology, but some basic principles seemed universal. Power flowed through circuits, and information was stored in crystalline matrices that resembled computer memory. After hours of careful work, Jake managed to restore partial function to the translator device. When Lyra put it around her neck again, it flickered to life with soft blue light. For the first time since the crash, she was able to speak in words that Jake and Amy could understand. Her voice was musical and strange, but the translator converted her thoughts into perfect English. The first thing she said was, "Thank you." The second thing she said was that her name was Princess Lirelei, and she was the daughter of a king who ruled 47 star systems across the galaxy. Amy nearly fainted when she realized she was talking to alien royalty. Jake just nodded like meeting space princesses was something that happened every day. But Lirelei seemed more interested in learning about humans than talking about her own importance. She asked endless questions about Earth and human civilization. She wanted to know how people lived without advanced technology and why they built cities from stone and metal instead of growing them from living crystal. She was amazed that humans could survive in such harsh conditions with such primitive tools. But Lirelei also recognized that humans possessed qualities her own people had lost. She was impressed by Jake's resourcefulness and Amy's curiosity. She said her people had become soft and dependent on their machines, while humans remained strong and adaptable. Amy used her communication equipment to contact her cousin Zara, who lived in a small town 50 miles away. Zara Kim was a brilliant engineer who worked on experimental aircraft for a private company. If anyone could help repair alien technology, it would be her. They waited until dark, then made their way through the forest toward the town. Military patrols were everywhere, but Jake knew the land well enough to avoid detection. Lirelei proved surprisingly good at moving quietly despite coming from a high-technology civilization. Along the way, Lirelei told them about her home world and the vast empire her father ruled. She described cities that floated in the clouds and ships that could travel between stars in the blink of an eye. But she also talked about feeling trapped and isolated in a life of luxury and ceremony. Jake understood that feeling better than most people. He had left human civilization because he felt trapped by its rules and expectations. In some ways, he and Lirelei were alike, despite coming from different worlds. They both wanted freedom more than safety and adventure more than comfort. They reached Zara's workshop just before dawn. The building was filled with half-finished aircraft and electronic equipment that Zara used for her engineering projects. When she saw Lyra Lay, her first reaction was to assume someone was playing an elaborate joke on her. But the alien technology was impossible to fake. Lyra Lay's damaged ship components were made from materials that did not exist on Earth. The power sources used principles that human science barely understood. Even the basic tools from her survival kit were centuries ahead of anything humans had developed. Zara threw herself into the challenge of understanding alien engineering, while Amy documented everything for scientific purposes. They worked through the day and into the night trying to repair the systems needed to get Lyra Lay home safely. The biggest problem was the navigation computer, which had been completely destroyed in the crash. Without it, Lyra Lay could not find her way back to her home system. The galaxy was vast beyond imagination, and even small errors in plotting a course could leave a ship lost forever in empty space. But Lyra Lay had memorized the star charts for her region of space as part of her royal education. Working with Zara, they managed to create a basic navigation system using human computers and alien sensors. It would not be as accurate as the original equipment, but it should be enough to reach Zephyrian territory. As they worked, Jake found himself growing closer to Lyra Lay in ways he had not expected. She was beautiful and intelligent, but more than that, she understood him in ways no human woman ever had. They were both outsiders in their own societies, and both willing to risk everything for freedom. Lyra Lay seemed to feel the same connection. She spent her free time talking with Jake about their different worlds and the dreams they shared. She told him about planets covered in flowers that sang in the wind and oceans filled with creatures that glowed like living stars. But Jake also learned about the dangers Lyra Lay would face when she returned home. Her father would be angry about her unauthorized journey, and the royal court would be scandalized by her contact with primitive humans. Worse yet, there were political enemies who would use her actions to challenge her position as heir to the throne. Jake made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He asked if he could travel with Lyra Lay back to her home world. He wanted to see the galaxy beyond Earth, and he wanted to stay with the woman he was falling in love with. Amy and Zara thought he was crazy. Space travel was dangerous enough for beings who were designed for it. A human making such a journey would be risking his life in ways that were almost impossible to calculate. But Jake had spent 5 years living alone in the wilderness because he needed to prove he could survive anything. Lyra Lay was torn between wanting Jake to come with her and knowing how dangerous it would be for him. Her people might see him as a curiosity or a threat rather than a friend. The royal court was not known for its tolerance of outsiders, especially primitive ones from backwater planets. But time was running out. Government forces were closing in on their location, and Lyra Lay's ship was finally ready for launch. They had to make a decision quickly before soldiers arrived to capture them all. Jake gathered supplies and equipment that might be useful on an alien world. Amy gave him medical supplies and scientific instruments, while Zara provided tools and spare parts for the ship. Both women were scared for their friend, but they understood his choice. Lyra Lay programmed the navigation system with coordinates for her home system, while Jake strapped himself into a passenger seat that had been modified for human anatomy. The ship was small and cramped, but it would carry them across impossible distances to worlds Jake had only dreamed about. They launched just as military vehicles surrounded the workshop. The ship rose silently into the night sky and passed through Earth's atmosphere without triggering any detection systems. Jake watched his home planet grow smaller below them until it was just another point of light among the stars. As they jumped into hyperspace toward the galactic core, Jake wondered if he would ever see Earth again. But when he looked at Lyra Lay, sitting beside him in the pilot's seat, he knew he had made the right choice. Whatever dangers waited ahead, they would face them together. The journey through hyperspace took 3 days, during which Jake learned about the vast civilizations that existed beyond human knowledge. Lyra Lay showed him Star, Captain Theron could not believe what his sensors were telling him. The small ship approaching his patrol vessel was broadcasting Princess Lyralei's personal identification codes, but that was impossible because the princess had been declared dead 3 days ago. Her ship had vanished without a trace during the diplomatic celebration, and search teams had found no sign of survivors. Yet here was her scout craft limping toward Zephyrian space with engine damage and communication systems barely functioning. Theron had grown up with Lyralei in the royal court, and he knew her ship's energy signature better than his own. This was definitely her vessel, but where had she been, and why was she returning now? Theron ordered his weapons officer to lower their targeting systems and opened a communication channel. When Lyralei's face appeared on his screen, he felt relief wash over him like a physical force. She was alive and apparently unharmed, but something was different about her. She looked older somehow, and there was a confidence in her eyes that had not been there before. The princess explained that her navigation system had malfunctioned during her unauthorized flight and thrown her ship into an unknown region of space. She had crash-landed on a primitive world and been forced to repair her vessel using local materials. The story was plausible enough, and Theron was too happy to see her alive to ask difficult questions. But then Lyralei mentioned that she was not alone. She had brought back a representative from the world where she had crashed. Theron's joy turned to confusion when she stepped aside to reveal the strangest being he had ever seen. The creature was obviously intelligent despite its primitive appearance. It wore crude clothing made from plant fibers and carried tools that looked like they had been hammered from raw metal. Its skin was pale instead of blue, and its limbs were shorter and thicker than any civilized species. Most disturbing of all, it had tiny eyes and thick hair covering the top of its head. Theron stared at the alien being while trying to process what he was seeing. In all his years of military service, he had encountered dozens of different species, but they were all advanced civilizations with technology and culture comparable to the Zephyrians. This creature looked like something from the prehistoric era before his people had learned to use tools. The being spoke, and Theron realized it was trying to communicate. Its voice was harsh and guttural compared to the musical tones of civilized speech, but the universal translator converted its words into understandable language. It said its name was Jake, and that it came from a world called Earth. Princess Lyralei seemed remarkably comfortable with this primitive alien. She spoke to it like an equal, and even seemed to defer to its opinions on certain matters. Theron wondered if the crash had affected her mind somehow, because no civilized person would treat such a crude being as anything more than a curiosity. But orders were orders, and Theron's duty was to escort the princess safely back to the capital world. He surrounded her ship with his patrol vessels and began the journey toward Luminara while sending coded messages ahead to announce her return. The news would spread rapidly through the Empire and reach King Vorthak within hours. During the flight, Theron tried to learn more about what had happened to Lyralei during her time away. She told him about the world called Earth, where billions of primitive beings lived without any advanced technology. They built cities from stone and metal instead of growing them from living crystal. They powered their machines by burning dead plants instead of using clean energy from the stars. Most shocking of all, these humans, as they called themselves, had never learned to travel between the stars. They were trapped on their single world, like insects in a jar, completely unaware of the vast civilizations that existed beyond their tiny solar system. Yet somehow they had managed to survive and even thrive under such primitive conditions. Lyralei spoke about the humans with obvious admiration, which troubled Theron greatly. She seemed to think their crude technology and violent history were somehow impressive rather than evidence of their inferior nature. She even suggested that advanced civilizations might learn something from studying human culture and methods. The alien called Jake remained quiet during most of the journey, but Theron could see it studying everything around it with intense curiosity. It examined the ship's systems and asked questions about Zephyrian technology that showed surprising intelligence for such a primitive being. Perhaps these humans were not as crude as they appeared. When they finally reached Luminara, Jake pressed against the viewing ports to stare at the capital city in obvious amazement. The floating towers and crystal spires must have seemed like magic to someone from such a backward world. Energy bridges connected buildings that hung in the air without any visible support, while streams of light carried traffic between different levels of the city. Theron could understand the aliens' wonder, because Luminara was one of the most beautiful cities in the galaxy, but he was disturbed by how quickly Jake seemed to grasp the basic principles behind Zephyrian architecture and engineering. Most primitive species would have been completely overwhelmed by such advanced technology. News of Princess Lyralai's return had already reached the palace by the time their ships entered the docking bay. Crowds of nobles and servants had gathered to welcome her home, but they fell silent when they saw the strange alien that emerged from her scout craft beside her. Jake looked around at the assembled Zephyrians with calm confidence rather than the fear or awe that might have been expected from such a primitive being. He stood straight and tall despite being surrounded by creatures that could destroy his entire world with a single thought. Either he was too stupid to understand the danger, or he possessed remarkable courage. King Vorthak arrived in the docking bay within minutes of their landing. The mighty ruler of 47 star systems embraced his daughter with tears streaming down his blue face. He had mourned her as dead, and her return was like a miracle from the ancient gods. But his joy turned to confusion when he noticed the alien standing nearby. Lyralai quickly introduced Jake as her friend and savior, who had helped her survive on the primitive world where she had crashed. She explained that he had risked his own life to protect her from hostile forces and had worked tirelessly to repair her ship. Without his help, she would never have made it home. The king studied Jake with the same intensity he reserved for potential enemies or valuable allies. Here was a being from a species so primitive they had never left their home world, yet this individual had somehow earned his daughter's respect and gratitude. Either Lyralai had been affected by her ordeal, or these humans possessed hidden qualities. Hi. Advisor Nexus arrived with a group of court officials and immediately began whispering urgent warnings in the king's ear. He pointed out that contact with primitive species could contaminate Zephyrian culture and introduce dangerous ideas that might threaten the stability of the empire. The alien should be studied by scientists and then sent back to its home world before it could cause any damage. But Princess Lyralai defended Jake with passionate intensity. She argued that humans, despite their primitive technology, possessed qualities that advanced civilizations had lost. They were adaptable and resourceful in ways that could benefit the entire galaxy if given the chance to prove themselves. The debate continued as they moved from the docking bay into the palace proper. Jake walked through halls decorated with priceless art and filled with technology beyond human comprehension, but he showed no signs of being intimidated. If anything, he seemed to be analyzing everything he saw with the sharp eyes of an engineer or scientist. King Vorthak finally decided that the alien would be treated as an honored guest while court scholars studied its species and culture. Jake would be given quarters appropriate for a foreign dignitary and provided with anything he needed for his comfort and safety. But he would also be watched carefully to ensure he posed no threat to Zephyrian security. Over the following days, Jake amazed everyone with his ability to adapt to alien customs and technology. He learned to use Zephyrian communication devices and transportation systems with remarkable speed. He even began to understand the complex social protocols that governed life in the royal court. More importantly, Jake proved his worth when a critical problem arose with the palace's environmental systems. The atmospheric processors that maintained air quality throughout the massive structure had developed a fault that Zephyrian engineers could not solve. Their automated repair systems were designed to handle known problems, but this was something new and unexpected. Jake studied the failed systems for hours using diagnostic tools that had been modified for his primitive hands. When he finally announced that he had found a solution, the Zephyrian engineers were skeptical. How could a being from such a backward world understand technology that was centuries beyond his species' capabilities? But Jake's solution was brilliantly simple. Instead of trying to repair the complex automated systems, he suggested bypassing them entirely with manual controls that could be operated by palace staff. The fix required only basic materials and could be implemented within hours, rather than the weeks needed to grow new biological components. The repair worked perfectly, and air quality throughout the palace returned to normal. Even High Advisor Nexus had to admit that the primitive alien High. The War Council chamber fell silent when Admiral Corvex finished his report about the approaching Devourer fleet. 12 massive ships were moving through Zephyrian space like a plague, consuming everything in their path. Entire worlds had gone dark as the mechanical monsters stripped them of all resources and life. King Vorthak stared at the tactical displays showing red markers advancing toward the capital system. Each symbol represented billions of his subjects, who would die if the Devourers could not be stopped. Traditional Zephyrian military doctrine called for meeting the enemy in open space with superior technology and overwhelming firepower. But the Devourers were different from any enemy the Empire had faced before. They were artificial beings created by a long-dead civilization as the ultimate weapon of war. They learned from every battle and adapted their tactics to counter whatever strategies were used against them. Conventional attacks had proven useless. High Advisor Nexus proposed evacuating the royal family to the outer systems while the military made a last stand at Luminara. At least some part of the empire might survive, even if the capital fell. Other nobles suggested negotiating with the Devourers to see if some arrangement could be reached. Jake listened to the debate with growing frustration. These people had technology that seemed like magic compared to anything on Earth, but they were thinking like generals from his own world. They wanted to fight the enemy using the same methods that had already failed against this particular threat. Princess Lyrelay noticed Jake's expression and asked for his opinion. The question brought shocked silence from the assembled nobles and military leaders. Why would anyone ask a primitive alien for advice about advanced military strategy? But King Vorthak was desperate enough to listen to any suggestions. Jake stood up and studied the tactical displays while trying to organize his thoughts. The Devourers were machines, which meant they would think like machines. They would analyze threats and respond with predetermined patterns based on their programming and previous experience. But humans had spent thousands of years fighting enemies who were stronger and better equipped than they were. They had learned to survive through cunning and creativity rather than superior technology. They had learned to think like prey animals that could sometimes become predators. Jake proposed a strategy that horrified the Zephyrian military leaders. Instead of meeting the Devourers in direct combat, he suggested letting them advance to the capital system while secretly evacuating the civilian population. When the enemy arrived, they would find what appeared to be a normal inhabited world defended by conventional forces, but hidden throughout the system would be small groups of volunteers equipped with weapons and explosives designed to look like primitive technology. When the Devourers landed their forces to begin harvesting operations, these hidden teams would attack from unexpected directions, using tactics the machines had never encountered. Admiral Corvex pointed out that such a plan would require sacrificing the fleet and most of the regular army as bait. The volunteers would be vastly outnumbered and under-equipped compared to their enemies. It was a strategy that could only end in massive casualties and probable failure. Jake agreed that many people would die, but pointed out that everyone would die anyway if conventional tactics were used. The Devourers had already proven they could defeat any direct assault. At least his plan offered some chance of success, even if it was a desperate gamble. King Vorthak made the hardest decision of his reign. He authorized Jake's unconventional strategy and placed him in command of the volunteer forces. Regular military units would provide the visible defense, while hidden teams prepared for guerrilla warfare against an enemy that had never faced such tactics. Over the next 3 days, Jake worked with Zephyrian engineers to design weapons that combined human concepts with alien technology. Simple projectile weapons were enhanced with energy systems that could penetrate Devourer armor. Primitive explosives were fitted with guidance systems that could target weak points in enemy machines. Princess Lyra Lee insisted on joining one of the volunteer teams despite her father's objections. She had learned about human determination during her time on Earth, and she wanted to fight alongside Jake rather than hide in safety. Her decision inspired other nobles to volunteer as well. Prince Valdris was outraged that his intended bride was being allowed to participate in such a dangerous mission. He demanded that King Vorthak put an end to this madness and arrange for the royal family to escape to safer territory. The prince could not understand why anyone would listen to ideas from a primitive alien. But other voices spoke in Jake's favor. Captain Theron had seen how quickly the human learned to understand Zephyrian technology. Engineers who had worked with Jake praised his ability to think of solutions that would never occur to anyone from an advanced civilization. Even some of the court nobles began to see Jake differently after witnessing his strategic planning abilities. Here was a being who thought in ways that their enemies could not predict or counter. His primitive origins might be exactly what they needed to defeat an enemy that had adapted to fight advanced civilizations. The Devourer fleet arrived right on schedule and immediately began their standard attack pattern. They destroyed the outer defense platforms with devastating efficiency, then moved toward the inhabited worlds while their sensors analyzed the defending forces. Everything appeared normal from their perspective. Zephyrian warships engaged the enemy in space battles that were designed to look desperate but futile. Brave crews sacrificed their lives to maintain the illusion that this was a conventional military response. The Devourers adapted their tactics accordingly and prepared for ground operations against a defeated enemy. Jake waited in hiding with 200 volunteers on the primary mining world that the Devourers would target first. His team was a mix of soldiers, palace guards, and civilian engineers who had learned to use the hybrid weapons he had designed. Princess Lyra Lee crouched beside him as enemy landing craft descended through the atmosphere. The Devourers deployed their forces with mechanical precision. Harvesting machines began stripping the planet's surface, while combat units secured key locations. Everything proceeded according to their programming until Jake's teams struck from concealed positions throughout the target area. The attacks came from directions the machines had not anticipated. Explosive charges detonated inside supposedly secure facilities, while sniper teams targeted command units from impossible angles. Most importantly, the weapons being used were unlike anything in the Devourer database. The mechanical warriors tried to adapt their tactics, but they could not counter strategies they did not understand. Human guerrilla warfare was based on unpredictability and creativity rather than superior technology. Every attack was different, and every ambush used methods the machines had never encountered. Jake's forces took heavy casualties, but they achieved their primary objective. The Devourer fleet was drawn into extended ground operations while hidden teams planted demolition charges in their ships. When the explosives detonated simultaneously, the enemy lost half their vessels in minutes. The surviving Devourers attempted to retreat, but found their escape routes blocked by Zephyrian forces that had been hidden in the outer system. Admiral Corvex led the counterattack that destroyed the remaining enemy ships and ended the threat to the Empire. King Vorthak arrived on the battlefield as the last Devourer machines were being destroyed. He found Jake wounded, but alive among the wreckage of what had been the most important battle in Zephyrian history. The primitive human had saved the Empire using tactics that no advanced civilization would have considered. The victory celebration lasted for days, and Jake found himself honored as a hero throughout the galaxy. News of his unconventional strategy spread to other civilizations that had suffered Devourer attacks. For the first time in centuries, the mechanical plague could be defeated, but Jake was more interested in personal matters than military glory. Princess Lyrelai had been injured during the final battle, and he had spent sleepless nights at her bedside while alien doctors worked to save her life. When she finally opened her eyes and smiled at him, Jake knew his journey to the stars had been worth every risk. King Vorthak faced the most difficult decision of his reign when Jake formally asked for permission to marry his daughter. The union between a Zephyrian princess and a primitive human would shock the galaxy and challenge traditions that had existed for thousands of years. But the king had learned to see Jake as more than just an alien curiosity. Here was a being who had saved the Empire and earned the love of his daughter through courage and sacrifice. Traditional prejudices seemed less important than the happiness of the woman who meant more to him than any crown or throne. High Advisor, Nexus, and Prince. Valdris led the opposition to such an unprecedented marriage. They argued that mixing Zephyrian blood with primitive genes would weaken the royal bloodline and set a dangerous precedent for the Empire. Other species might demand similar recognition if humans were accepted as equals. But Princess Lyrelai had found her voice during the battle against the Devourers. She spoke before the assembled court with the authority of someone who had proven herself in combat. She declared that she would marry Jake Morrison of Earth with or without off.